Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our session, Preserving the James and Grace Lee Boggs House, Social Justice and Cross-Racial Solidarity. My name is Scott Kurashige. I am the president of the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. I'm also the author of a book that Grace and I did together called The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century. If you want to check it out, I brought some copies. And I currently work at Shoreline Community College as the director of the Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions program. And we're just very happy to have you all here today. Thank you to APIAHiP for including us in this program. And I wanted to say one more thing. I wanted to first know, how many of you know who James and Grace Lee Boggs are? Okay, so most people, great, all right. So just wanted to get a sense of that. But for those of you who don't know or being introduced to them, I come from the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. And we are working to preserve the historic home of James and Grace Lee Boggs on the east side of Detroit as a community museum to honor their revolutionary lives and works. James Boggs was born in 1919, and he was an African-American auto worker and labor organizer from Marion Junction, Alabama, in the rural Jim Crow South. He moved to Detroit during the height of the industrial era, and he later met Grace Lee Boggs, who was born in 1915 in Providence, Rhode Island, to Chinese immigrant parents, raised in New York City. And then after obtaining her PhD in philosophy, Grace was spurned by academia and made her home in the Black community and Black movement. Jimmy and Grace married in 1953, and together the Boggses foresaw the devastation of Detroit and crisis in the U.S. owing to automation, white supremacy, militarism, authoritarianism, and the emphasis on technological over human development. Through writing and organizing, they struggled to move the nation beyond the stage of rebellion against an unjust system by encouraging organizers and all members of society to see revolution as the exercise of self-government and an evolutionary advance for humanity. So the Boggs Museum will be a dynamic site of history, culture, and activism, offering lessons from past struggles for today's movement builders, working to reimagine everything, that was one of Grace's favorite phrases, and shake the world with a new dream. The museum will be embedded within a movement-oriented neighborhood that inspires people of all ages to transform ourselves and our societal structures through radical models of education, urban farming, cooperative ownership, collective care, and self-governance. We seek to demonstrate what our world will look and feel like when we prioritize collective life and humanity over capitalist profit and exploitation. So today our first speaker is going to be Tiffany Lee, who was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, by her father, Robert C. Lee, who was Grace's older brother. She currently serves, and hope I got this right, as a senior administrator for workforce and professional development in the state of Washington's Department of Children, Youth, and Families, in the Early Learning Division. Grace and Jimmy's legacy inspires her to approach education policy using racial justice as the singular lens to guide decision-making, and she's also a member of the advisory board of the Boggs Foundation. I will come up again for my presentation after Tiffany, and then we're very honored to have from Los Angeles, Theresa Hwang, who is the director of the Department of Places. She is a community-engaged architect, educator, and facilitator. She has spent over 15 years focused on equitable cultural and community development with multiple groups and campaigns. Additionally, she is the program director of Design Futures Student Leadership Forum, a national anti-racist design education initiative. She was the former director of community design and planning at the Skid Row Housing Trust, a nonprofit permanent supportive housing organization. Theresa Hyuna received her Master of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I put the year in 2007 because it made me realize I met you like just after that, so 16 years ago when there was another election going on. And last but not least, we're very delighted and honored to have Omar Eaton Martinez, who is the Senior Vice President for Historic Sites, where he leads the preservation, interpretation, and overall stewardship of 28 National Trust historic sites across the country to tell the full American story, of course, at the National Trust. He has had leading roles in racial equity organizations like Museums and Race, Transformation and Justice, and Museum Hue, as well as a part of the Museum as a Site for Social Action Project. Omar participated as an American Alliance of Museums Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Senior Fellow, which is dedicated to diversifying museum boards. Certainly use more of that. And he is a gubernatorial appointee to the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first commission of its kind in the country. I'm actually leaving a lot of things out of it, but you'll get to hear from him. Omar, but I don't want to leave out, Omar is the current president of the board of directors of the Association of African American Museums and a member of the Executive Council for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. So as we're talking about Jimmy and Grace, having lives that cut across Black and Asian American history and communities, really excited to have a panel that reflects those experiences as well. So, Tiffany Lee, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Aloha kakariaka. Good morning. So as Scott mentioned, my father in the middle of this picture of Jimmy and Grace, my father was a year older, Grace's older brother. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1914 on Valentine's Day. And as you know, Grace was born in 1915, so they were very close in age. My father and Grace wrote each other very frequently. As one of my chores when you were little and growing up, getting the mail, fetching the mail is a very common chore. And I would remember, even as a little kid, sort of thinking about how special it was that they wrote so frequently to each other, that I was bringing these letters. And man, I wish that I had those, because that would have been really exciting to read. But he often talked of Grace and hinted at her activism with pride as we were growing up, but we didn't really have a sense of truly her impact until we watched the film. And so I just, as a part of the family, it's really interesting to see and exciting to see that her impact continues to grow, and that we're still seeing this progress that we're really proud of as a family. And this is at the gravesite of my grandmother, Grace and my dad's mother. She moved to Hawaii to stay with my dad. She had a very special relationship with my dad, and as some people know, Grace had a very interesting relationship with her mother. Interesting, this is us. They visited twice, and so this was their second visit. My dad, what a box at the top, do you see? Very nice. And not unlike Grace, she's very beautiful. And she is over there on the left-hand side, and Grace, or Jimmy, next to me on the right. And in the bluish top is my sister Sandra, and on the bottom is my brother Jonathan. So there I am. Wow, that's a long time ago. And this was the first visit. I'm a little younger. Sandra, Jonathan, and myself. Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to add that, so James and Grace Lee Boggs' house, its preservation is really very important to the family, and in communicating with my siblings and my cousins about this work and about this presentation, I asked, why is this so important? And we have a proclivity to sort of bringing it personal, because I know that there are so many important impacts globally, but for us, we have this sense that that generation, my dad and Grace and their siblings, that generation, they created a very small family, and there are so few of us. It's not this big extended family. And we have someone in Minnesota, and then of course Grand Rapids, Michigan, and then Honolulu, and then here in Washington State. And the preservation of this house really is sort of like the core of our identity, if you will. It's something that we have all that we can talk about in common, even though we're spread out among many states, and something that we're so proud of, because the extraordinary life that they led and the impact that they continue to have is something that we're so proud of. So I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany. It's really honored to have you with us. So I want to say just something first about the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. We were established in 2017 based on directives in the will of Grace Lee Boggs. So it's really, we are following Grace's wishes and carrying them out. We have a multiracial leadership team centered on Black and Asian American organizers and also family members who work most closely with Jimmy and Grace in Detroit, and supported, we're also supported, as I mentioned, by designated representatives from the Boggs and Lee family. So Grace didn't have any children of her own. Jimmy had children from his prior relationship, and many of them still live in the Detroit area, and we're really honored to work with them as well. So one of the main things Grace designated in her will is that the foundation would be the owner of Jimmy and Grace's personal and intellectual property, their estate, so to speak. So we really seek to make the humanity-stretching work of Jimmy and Grace knowable and meaningful for current and future generations, drawing upon this incredible historic archive, but also engaging, again, in the preservation of their works, their lives, and of course their physical homes. Through public scholarship, narrative change work, leadership development, and movement building educational programs. And this is really important to me because Jimmy and Grace have really had an enduring significance. In part because they were visionary thinkers. Even when they were organizing in the 40s and the 60s and the 80s, they were really thinking about creating a future, right? A different society. Using their combined 135 years of activism in major movements of the past century: labor, civil rights, Black power, Asian American, environmental justice, feminism, and more. As Jamel Bowie, you may know, is a very prominent columnist in the New York Times, pointed out, what's so important about their vision is they recognize that the change we need is revolutionary, right? So this column came out June 2020 amid the protest demonstrations following the murder of George Floyd. And what Bowie is saying is really drawing upon, James Boggs' 1963 book, The American Revolution. Protests are a stage in social change and transformation, but the protest and the rebellion does not itself bring about what the Boggs has talked about as revolution. And, when we think about Jimmy and Grace and we think about cross-racial solidarity, they got married 71 years ago. They actually got married after their very first date. Grace and Jimmy asked him to marry her on that evening. And they actually didn't start very. You got to watch the movie. The date started out horribly. And they ended up getting engaged by the end of the night. So 71 years ago, the idea of a Black Asian couple was an oddity in America, right? It put them on the fringe of U.S. society. Fortunately, today, everyone in America understands that a Black Asian couple is now such a common occurrance, right? That it's a reflection of our multi-ethnic society. Almost everybody. Maybe not everybody. But Jimmy and Grace, their union helps us to imagine how another America is possible. And this has actually captured the imagination of Hollywood. Has anyone seen this movie on Netflix called Barry? So it's about Barack Obama being a college student at Columbia. And he's biracial and he doesn't fit into like Harlem's black society, but doesn't fit in fully into Columbia's like predominantly white elite society. And he actually like resolves his identity crisis and sees himself as like the center of the future of America in the movie when he meets James and Grace Lee Boggs. So these are actually actors playing Jimmy and Grace and inspiring a young Barack Obama to believe that he is the future. Now, that's fictional. Maybe you know Tiffany, I don't know. But true story, the surge of anti-Asian attacks during the COVID-19 pandemic saw activists quoting Grace, citing her legacy and her work as a model of transformative activism all around the country. There are people who have tattoos of Grace Lee Boggs quotes. It's really amazing. At rallies, events, and so on. And amid signs of a systemic breakdown and cruel disregard for humanity, grassroots organizers and high-level policymakers alike have driven home Grace's societal wake-up call, quote, "The only way to survive is by taking care of one another." So there are people that have this, children of the Grace Jimmy Boggs Afro-Asian Solidarity generation. In fact, when Kamala Harris was inaugurated as vice president in 2021, she released a video called Who Came Before? And it started, of course, with her mother, and then it showed a series of women in activism and politics who inspired, others who made it possible for a new generation of women to advance into leadership. And just because we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, I should also point out Jill Stein on Election Day in 2016 also tweeted it, sort of Grace's inspiration to her. Cornel West has also cited Grace's inspiration. Okay, getting to the house. The Boggs house is located at 3061 Field Street in Detroit. It's an approximately 100-year-old building, and it's a historic site of movement activism. Jimmy and Grace moved here in 1962. Actually, their house before that was taken by eminent domain, ironically to build a school that is now the site of the James and Grace Lee Boggs School. And this was their home until they both joined the ancestors, Jimmy in 1993 and Grace in 2015. During this time, they welcomed people engaged in virtually every movement of the 20th century and into the 21st century into this home. They helped people develop new visions and programs to reimagine education, end war and violence, turn vacant lots into urban farms, and redefine local economies by prioritizing human needs over private profit. The city of Detroit recognized this house as a historic district in 2012. And through a process overseen and funded by the Michigan State Government's History Center, the house has now been nominated to become a state historic monument. And it's going to have a large sign installed for the first time, hopefully next year, by the end of next year. Again, the exterior is nice to look at, but it's the interior where we really get a sense of their lives, especially if you never got a chance to meet them in person. The house retains nearly all of the actual furnishings, artwork, and books that Jimmy and Grace accumulated, much of which actually dates back to the 1950s, stuff they took with them from their prior apartment. And so when I first visited Detroit and stayed with Grace nearly 25 years ago, I slept on that actual couch. Who else has been on this couch before? So the house already looked like a museum when I visited Grace 25 years ago. But really, it's also a center of revolutionary politics and philosophy. This is where they developed their ideas, strategies, where they did much of their writing of their most influential books, and please Google to see, all their titles. And this philosophical and political work carries on through the words and actions of thousands of organizers, artists, scholars, and policymakers drawing inspiration from the Boggses. But it's also in a broader neighborhood and territory that we talk about as creating a liberated territory. Because it will first draw visitors from all over the world, from K through 12 students in Detroit to national and international travelers making a trek to the source of the Boggs' inspirational vision, a pilgrimage of sorts. It is located in a majority black and working class neighborhood. As you can see, the green is where there are existing historic districts in Detroit. Most of them tend to be more towards downtown. The east side has a dearth of, historic sites, particularly tied to black and people of color histories. That big green one near the house is actually it's really interesting. You have to go to Detroit. These are like mansions of like the millionaires who built the auto industry,
Oh my gosh.
over 100 years ago. And then right next to it, you see, closer to Grace's neighborhood, blocks that have far more vacant lots than houses, right? In some of the most low-income neighborhoods in the whole country. So, part of the reason the house is now being designated by the state is the state got a grant and they reached out and they were really looking to see how could the National Park Service called the diversity deficit be addressed, right, in the historic monuments of the state, which tend to be more basically if you had the money and you were a property owner, you could pay the state to do this for the nomination. And so they actually had volunteers come forward and propose how to redress it. So we didn't even nominate it. Actually, it got nominated for us by this equity process. So, we see the house, as it has always been and should continue to be, a nexus of revolutionary urban transformation, a symbol of Black Asian solidarity, drawing people from diverse backgrounds, and providing a tangible alternative to downtown models of urban redevelopment and corporate gentrification in Detroit and other cities. And in conjunction, as I mentioned, with the Boggs School, which is just a block and a half away. As I said, that's where their apartment was before, and that's Tiffany in front of the school earlier this summer. And other local partners, the museum will encourage the formation of holistic community buildings. So it's a living museum, right, and historic district that will serve as a model of what Grace called visionary organizing, providing living examples of a more humane system through universal and accessible design, educational programs and exhibits, art installations and performances, and hopefully an edible garden. And keep in mind, Detroit had, in the time I lived there for about 14, 15 years, 200 public schools closed down, right? The whole public school system has basically been eviscerated. Over 100,000 homes going into foreclosure, right? Just during, the economic crisis, right? Spending more money on putting Detroiters in prison than educating them, right? So this is the type of environment that the Boggs really were challenging us to move beyond and see alternatives. And so we see the museum really not just as a historic site, but as a symbol of creating a much better world. And so if you want to know more about Jimmy and Grace, I'm going to stop here. You can watch the film. You start with the film American Revolutionary. To get a sense of how their lives and activism were centered in Detroit. And this massive abandoned auto factory, the Packard, from the Packard Automobile Company, is very close to where Jimmy and Grace live, right? So you have these scenes of so-called blight and devastation, but Grace always said we have to see those vacant lots and abandoned factories as promise rather than, despair. So, in conclusion, the Boggs has taught us it's not enough to denounce or rebel against the existing system of injustice. Transformative change requires projecting a more humane alternative to a system rooted in racism, inequity, and dehumanization. We are already living within a systemic collapse. The challenge of our lifetime is to imagine and organize a better system rather than succumb to the forces who want a system that's even worse than the one we have now. For this reason, our highest aspiration is not only to preserve the house, but create a living museum and historic district centered on cooperative models of housing, work, farming, childcare, maker spaces, public art, healing justice, and keystones to de-escalate violence and deter reliance on police. Just as Jimmy and Grace did in their lifetimes, we invite you to join us on this journey and be part of a movement that is bigger than all of us as individuals. A movement that gives meaning and purpose to our lives while creating a better world for our children and their children.
Thank you, Tiffany. Mic check for that. Everybody, how are you all feeling? Good. Can you hear me? Yes. Here we go. Hello, people. I'm very excited to share my work. I actually feel a little nervous because I'm talking about the influence and impact that Jimmy and Grace have had on my professional work. I've shared my work for decades, and to actually look at it through the specific lens, it feels more personal. And so, I'm excited to be a little bit more intentional because I think the way that Jimmy and Grace's writing has influenced me, I haven't been as directly explicit about the way that it has influenced my professional practice as an architect. And so I want to, my presentation is actually going to be non-linear in the way that I share parts of my story. I start with these two books because I would say almost 25 years ago when I graduated college, my older sister gave me Grace's autobiography, Living for Change, and when I read it, it completely changed my life. I think it was the first time that I read an intimate narrative of an Asian American woman activist doing movement work. And I think it was the first time that I was able to place myself within larger movement work. And so, I think I was just really lucky to meet Grace, 21, let's say, and have sort of the work really guide me, but really call Grace one of my political teachers and ancestors. And so I just want to ground it with where I am right now. I'm going to shout out Sustainable Little Tokyo. One of the beloved communities that I have the honor to work in. I think, Kristen Fukushima talked about Sustainable Little Tokyo in the opening plenary as some of this visionary organizing, right? Instead of just resisting and fighting against, what is the future that we long for, that it encompasses and demonstrates our cultural practices. For me, as a built environment practitioner, what is the cultural infrastructure? What is the permanence that we need in order for our ways of living, our ways of being and knowing directly tied to the land and the neighborhoods? And so, since 2015, I've been able to work formally in Little Tokyo. And so when the vision came out in 2012, I was actually a participant. Little Tokyo has always been a place that I've gone to. For me, it was like cultural mecca where I would go, when I think about a grain of sand and, East meets West players, like this is where I felt like Asian American cultural arts was headed. And so I've always just been a visitor, a stakeholder. So I participated in the visioning process. And then it wasn't until I left my job working in an adjacent community, Skid Row, where actually Dean, when I call in other political teachers and ancestors, first he tried to hire me after I left my job, but also was the one who formally invited me to work with LTSC, thinking about cultural strategies in their creative placekeeping work. And so from there, we have updated the SLT 2012 and 2013 vision a few times. And so these are some of the street engagements and community workshops that we've done. So my work is really about how do people who aren't formally trained as designers, urban planners, architects, deeply inform and guide what the community development process should be. So I try to use as accessible materials as possible, but really root things in experience. And so we came up with, instead of, SLT, the original vision was a very long-term, almost 30-year out vision. We were like, the metro is going to open up by 2020. We need we need an immediate short-term plan for now. And so we went through various different conversations. I think we've had countless number of meetings, hundreds of people were involved, and we came up with a list of priorities. But also more importantly, how can people show up responsibly into our community? And so it almost was like a planning policy document, but really couched in political campaigns and direct action. And so from there, I feel like the way that I found myself working within Asian American communities, now I'm going to flash back 20 years to sort of the time period that Scott was originally talking to when I was in grad school. So, I think when I went into architecture school, I was very optimistic in that I wanted to, create community centers and spaces for our people to be in beautiful surroundings. And then when I went to graduate school, it was like, you got to learn these very complicated computer programs, which clearly I'm not into. But I realized, design education still is very much rooted in white supremacy, where you are thinking about the object, right? The objectification of containers. And so for me, I think I realized I've always had an organizer spirit. And so I was more focused on sort of like, actually, what are the programs, right? Like, what are the policies? Like, what are the things that we need in order for our people to feel safe and welcome and belong? And so what do you do when like school is terrible? You try to find your people. And so I was in grad school. So I moved to Cambridge, Boston area. It was like 2003. This was like the height of like the spoken word movement. And so the way that it was like you look for the poets. I think now still, right? It's the poets that are telling us the future that we long for. And so I was fortunate enough to make friends with poets, with MCs, DJs, community organizers. And from there, we reopened up an Asian American bookstore. And so we started an open mic. We created our own space to share our own stories, right? Because even 20 years ago, it was a very flat narrative of who and what Asian American was. And so this was less about, how do we convey our story to others, but it's like, we just need space for ourselves. And so for me, when people ask like, oh, what's been your most meaningful professional experience? It's always been like, running an Asian American bookstore, hosting an open mic. These were the core foundational pieces for facilitation, right? It's like, how do you set a vibe? Like every time I see Emily, I'm like, this is a community process, right? Like when we gather. And so it's like you learn how to hold a space for people to feel vulnerable and like tell their story. And then, so this has been my deep work. This was like my real school of thought in terms of what informed what my design education should be. And so like, this is beautiful, right? Like this is what we want all the time. And so for me, that's what seeded the why, but also like how I wanted to practice. And so when I finished grad school, it was just like, the last thing I want to do is work for an architect and design rich people's houses, So I worked in Boston Chinatown with young people, talked about, design from more of an experiential standpoint, and thinking about how, especially young people who have a vision for the future, how that they can also, become designers, rethinking what design education should be. And then so from there, I think I did miss the built environment. I think I realized, this was a very important skill set that I've acquired, but also this idea of permanence, right? This idea of physical infrastructure was really important. And so, I have a quote, and also, Grace and Jimmy have a big presence on my ancestral altar at home. And so this quote, that a revolution that is based on people exercising their creativity in the midst of devastation is one of the great historical contributions of humankind. To me, that was like design direction, right? It's like the people who have experienced directly the systems of oppression should actually be the ones designing systems of liberation that we should be living in, these liberated territories, that Scott was talking about. And so, while I loved a lot of the youth education and really just organizing work that I was continuing to do, I wanted to return to the built environment. And so, this was it was right after actually Emily and Scott were in Boston for a stint that the Great Recession hit, and it was like, oh my gosh, there's no work. And so I think I was very lucky. I got this architecture fellowship where they placed designers in affordable housing nonprofits across the country. And so in 2009, I moved from Boston to LA and started to do affordable housing work in Skid Row. And so this is where I'm working in completely unfamiliar territory. Not only I'm a New Yorker, I've lived on the East Coast my whole life, but also I've never experienced, homelessness. And so there was a lot of, just checking, like, what am I doing here? And so the more I started to, I think, be in this organization, I started to recognize what it meant to practice allyship through a professional lens, right? So what does that mean? So that started to look more like the role of a facilitator, right? It's about building capacity within the community. It's less about this like visionary architect, right? That we're told, creates a vision and sort of imposes. It was instead about, how do we hold space so that the people are the ones actually guiding the vision. And so I just started working on the organization. So it's like, what do I know? I know that the people who are most directly impacted by the issue should be the ones making decisions and guiding what the design could be. So a lot of the work that I did at a housing organization was how do we have conversations, how do we distill what the housing development process is so that residents, people who were formerly unhoused, could be a part of the decision-making process. And so a lot of what I did was like, how do we tweak property management? How do we tweak social services so that it becomes more of a co-creative process? And then from there, working full-time in the community, spending at least, I would say, 3-4 years just like deeply learning, but also being very mindful of what my footprint was. Started to think about sort of the limitations of housing. As I think it went back to like, we're looking at systemic issues and expecting an object to solve a larger networked problem. And so what we did actually, Sustainable Little Tokyo, the 2013 process, the 2012 process was a big inspiration of, communities of color leading the vision for where they want to go. The People's Plan in Boyle Heights was also a very inspirational project. And so what we decided was we needed to create a neighborhood vision for Skid Row. So we went through and launched a participatory planning process where instead of thinking about permanent supportive housing, we started thinking about permanent supportive neighborhood. So thinking about, the services, the types of amenities, the relationships that you need in order for the whole neighborhood to feel like it is centering the needs of the community. And so we did everything from, so I rethought the whole entire design process. So this is the way that we collected data, asset mapping, existing conditions. All of it was participatory. It was rooted in, residents were the ones doing the analysis, asking the questions, collecting the information, to multiple forms of design expression, model making, drawing, to also then starting to co-facilitate meetings as well. And so as the process continued, for me it was less about sort of like the person standing in the front of the room with all the information, but it was more about like gather resources, right? Like I have access to so many conversations, privileged seats. How do we find money? How do we get people paid? And then the reality is like, take out the trash, right? Buy the food, let the people have space to talk. And so rethinking about engagement, not expecting people to always come to us, but also being culturally responsive and appropriate. Skid Row was a community where everything happens outside on the corner. So that's where we had our design workshops as well. And so our planning planning document ended up being like a two-sided poster, right? I think a lot of times it's also like what is appropriate for people. A 200-page written document PDF is often not accessible for everybody. So we, worked with an amazing artist illustrator, Roscoe Wu, who's like renowned for distilling complex ideas into visual, easy visuals. And so this became almost like a demand packet as well. So like residents would go to the council member with this poster and be like, these are the things that we've talked about. So this was like a 3-year planning process. We probably had over 20 meetings, over 500 people engaged. And then every single step of the way, it was residents saying like, yes, no, change this in terms of the decision-making process. And then from there, thinking more short-term, beyond just like a long-term planning document, we created sort of pop-up representations of what we wanted. And so for me, this was a really important exercise in how do I share the tools that I've learned, right, through a lot of these very privileged institutions, but also realize like it's not about me, right? And so there were many resonant, I think, issues, right? Like issues of substance abuse, of mental illness, things that have directly impacted my own family, my own community, that I have deeply resonated with. But it was also important for me to sort of like step back and recognize, the role is more about facilitation and creating containers for folks. As opposed to being the one to sort of assert a vision for what the future could be. And so I think when the quote got cut off, but when I really think about, especially Jimmy and Grace, so much of the political is deeply personal, right? And so for me, it's not just the way that it shows up in my professional practice. It's always about then the check-in side, right? So one of the quotes that you always hear all the time is, in order to transform the world, we must transform ourselves. So I think about, what are the forms of anti-Blackness that still show up in my own body, in my family, in my beloved communities, right? I think that's a question we always need to continue asking of each other. For me, yes, I work in Little Tokyo, historically Asian American communities, but it's always still in support of the liberation of Black lives, right? A lot of the work is still guided by anti-Black racism, and that being sort of like the groundwater in which we are all treading on. And so I always ask, now in my own personal life, this photo is an example of, I play traditional Korean drums as like a connection to, my ancestral lands and my ancestral peoples. But we are a politicized group where we now show up for other communities of color, right? It's another form of sort of cultural solidarity. And so I'm constantly asking myself, right, what are the things that I need to change within myself in order to be, I think, experienced and embodied in holding containers to transform the world that move us toward these liberated materials.
This is why we can't work to make us visible. This is why we can't work to make us visible.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am very happy to be with you all this morning. This is my first time in Seattle. And certainly my first time being able to speak at this forum. It's been amazing so far. Everybody's been very warm and welcoming. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do following Scott and Theresa. What am I supposed to say? So Scott gave me a very specific direction. Just respond. So that's what I'm going to do. I would say when I first heard about this house, and I first heard about what Scott was doing through the foundation, I was being very selfish in my thoughts. Let me explain. As the Senior Vice President for Historic Sites at the National Trust, we have these 28 sites, but they exist in 3 different relationships. And one of them is the affiliate relationship where we enter into an affiliate agreement with another organization that has a shared affinity in telling the full American story, and we share best practices, share marketing, and provide some technical assistance. That's the first thing my mind went to. I was like, how can I get this to be part of the trust in that network in that way? But also because the stories that it's telling and has the potential to tell really fit a trajectory that I think is in line with what we're marking to in the trust, but also what's sorely missing in this country, right? So when I think about the work of James and Grace Lee Boggs, my mind goes to the 60s and the original Rainbow Coalition. I think about coalition building within and among different ethnicities, right? I think about what Fred Hampton did in Chicago, bringing the Young Lords and us Panthers together along with the Young Patriots, the poor white folks from Appalachia, together to talk about these issues. I know some of that work was extended in a different capacity, even on the West Coast, with the Hwang and other like really radical thinking, social justice centered organizations. And for me, if we can support work like this, then what it does, it removes the false notion that this type of activism is a blip in the matrix, that there's an actual trajectory of activism and resilience of this country since its beginning. And so I tag it back to the work that we're doing at the Trust with descendant engagement at our sites of enslavement. Right? We're doing this work where we're bringing in together the descendants of the enslaved, and we're giving them agency, and we're giving them voice, and we're working with them to tell the truth about what happened on those plantations. And we're not just interpreting the beauty of a mansion of a white slave owner, we're actually talking about the labor and the trauma that was caused, and it's still felt in those communities today, right? That's the important work. The important work of what James and Grace Lee Boggs did still resonates today because we're still living it today. It's just not something we historicize or folkloricize as if it just happened back then, and we get the really awkward, inappropriate question about why are we still talking about this? There should never be a reason why somebody formulates that question. Right? If you have the proper context of what happened, you will never ask that question if you're a sincere human being, right? And so I think that this work is what really will set that off in a way that's beautiful. I'm also thinking about the work of the Poor People's Campaign, the original Poor People's Campaign, but certainly the one that's happening now under Reverend Barber's leadership. Just thinking about how Dr. King was setting that up with Ralph Abernathy and bringing in all these folks to do the original Occupy movement on the mall, and how do we really think about what that looked like, what that should look like in perpetuity until we continue to get this thing right? Because I think a lot of times when we talk about the goals of our country, they're simply aspirational at best. But when we start doing the work of preserving the culture and the legacy of activism, then it starts to connect the dots for everyone. No matter what, you don't need a PhD in this to make that connection, right? But you do need an opportunity to be immersed in that space, or at least be able to be a part of the education and the interpretation that comes from those spaces, whether or not you go to those spaces or there's outreach into your communities or through virtual or through others, some type of a virtual or outreach way to connect with folks. So I think that's really, really important in terms of the work we're talking about today. I also am thinking about the idea of disrupting this parochial lens of activism. And again, this is going on with the coalition building, because when I hear that, what I think about is the idea of Ubuntu. I am because we are, right? This is an African concept that many people work through, may not even know it's an African concept, but it is. And it really describes interconnectedness, right? So if I'm trying to support Black lives, I'm trying to support all different types of people who are on the margins. what I love about the 60s and the Panthers and the Lords and our Hwang and those types of groups, they were always internationalists in their activism. They were never just saying, well, I'm focused on what's happening in Harlem, I'm focused on what's happening in the South Side of Chicago. They were concerned about what's happening in Rwanda, they were concerned about what's happening in Brixton, and they were concerned what's happening in Gaza, right? They weren't just, that's over there, right? And so for me, I think that this work also helps to expand our mind and to remind ourselves as American citizens and residents that we are part of a global network of humanity. God forbid we forget, right? And so this, again, this work really helps support that. It also helps me think about an idea that came about at President Lincoln's Cottage, one of our co-stewardship sites in Washington, D.C., where they worked with a gaming organization and they created this game board called Brave Ideas. And basically, it's a series of prompts to help people get an idea and immerse themselves in what a brave idea would look like, understanding that, Lincoln and others were parts of these brave ideas during his presidency, before and after. And I'm thinking, how could it extend at the House with revolutionary ideas, right? Thinking about things from a radical point of view, and also reframing the word radical as some type of, it's not an evil word, right? When people say, oh, they're radicalizing something, they usually mean something negative, right? So how do we retake ownership of that word in a way that is not negative, it's positive. It's just a way for us to understand how we move in a more nuanced and effective way. And so again, when we talk about doing historic preservation, and we talk about preserving the cultural legacy of social justice, for me, that's where we have the work. And I'll end. I don't think there's a whole lot more for me to say based on what I just heard. But for me, what I really motivated by what Dr. Cornel West always says, that is, love is what justice looks like in public.
Wow.
So, where's love? When we talk about doing this work, people don't like talking about, oh, that's too hokey, that's too emotional. I think sometimes we do preservation where we really hone down on the technical way too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I care less about your wooden nails, to be honest with you. But how do people interact with that space, right? How do those stories compel them to do something different than they're doing now? How does it make sense for us to be able to walk into a space, create an immersive experience that's transformational and makes our society better? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you all. The floor is open for questions.
My name is Hwang, I look for culture. I'm still inspired and moved by what each of you said on the panel today. Thank you so much. Maybe this question is for Scott and Tiffany. What are the barriers right now in having this house online? Is it already accessible to the public? Where are you at?
Thank you for that question. So I would start by saying, it's a real honor to be charged with grace, with carrying on this legacy and both the physical embodiment of their lives, but obviously a lot of it is, in the world of ideas and spiritual thinking. And as I often say, Jimmy and Grace were incredibly rich in spirit, because they devoted their lives not to material wealth, but to advancing humanity. And so one of the things is they bequeathed us this incredibly, rich treasure trove of papers and objects and history, but they didn't have a lot of money, right? So, dealing with a house that's over 100 years old and trying to not just, as Omar said, preserve the building, but do the necessary programming and care work and community building that goes along with it, it takes a lot. I mean, first thing, it takes vision and it takes people, but it also takes material resources, right? So that's just an obvious thing up front is we're still at the phase of turning the ideas into, a material reality. And it's going to take a long time. And so, I think that's one, but fortunately, we've been able to do some fundraising, reach out to the foundation world. And because of all the work you all are doing, especially the work, that Omar and his colleagues are doing, that funding landscape has changed, right? I mean, I think there's been some challenges. In 2020, there were a lot of advances. Now it's like we're sort of in that, backlash. But, I think hopefully we will continue to move forward there. And I'll just throw it out there. I mean, we're always we're basically an all-volunteer leadership body, right? Right now. We're hoping to, again, move towards having the type of staffing that we need to sustain this work. But we're always looking for folks who have ideas, technical expertise, professional expertise, just time and care and passion, right? Go to our website, boggsfoundation.org. Let us know how you would like to be involved or help us.
Hi, I just have a clarifying question for Omar. I'm a landscape architect, so I don't always necessarily work in preservation, and I wasn't familiar with your office, with your organization before, and you had a long job title. Could you just let me know what it is that you do?
Sure, yeah, the person right next to you can help you out too, but I work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a national nonprofit, and we do many things, including saving places, and that may come in the way of having houses. We have historic houses all across the country, some that we own and operate, and some that we just own, and another nonprofit operates in a co-stewardship agreement, and then thirdly, which was the designation I referred to earlier, which was an affiliate, where we neither own it or anything like that, but we do have a share of thing around telling the truth. We also do a lot of advocacy work. We do a lot of research and development, which is what Dee does next to you. She leads our whole Chinatown initiative. And we also have grant-making, which has really become one of the bigger assets of the institution, which is we provide monies to people who want to restore, preserve their historic spaces.
Hi everyone, Kevin Kim, UNC Chapel Hill. I'm not a particularly religious fan, but I feel like I've just gone to church. Hearing from all the speakers, and my question is to the panel, but it's kind of touched by what Omar said, is how do you talk to, whether it's corporate boardrooms or foundations or state halls of representatives? I'm from North Carolina, so I think we've all read the headlines of what's going on there. And I've been in some hostile rooms, the kind of shared coalition building, radical world making that we want to do in some of our programs and our projects. And I'm curious, how do you talk to folks who may not love you back?
Where's the love, Kevin Kim? Kevin, I go way back 10 years. There's a different answer for every situation you want. I would never try to purport any one cookie cutter answer for you. That would be super irresponsible. Right? I could tell you that for me, in my experience, what works best is when our networks go beyond our echo chambers, right? So what I mean by that is when museums are working with preservationists, and preservationists are working with librarians. Librarians are working with, art gallery folks, and all the people that do public humanities and public education, higher ed. When all of us are singing in harmony together, I think it's very, very hard for those folks to tell them about that. Very hard, right? But we have to be able to build coalitions that way. And I think, again, we just get in our own way. We build our echo chambers, we come to our conferences, same conferences every year, we hug up on our people, we say goodbye, we never meet anybody new, we never go reach out, we never go find out what the next person's doing right next door to us sometimes, and see what's working, what's not working. We have to do better by creating more nuanced coalitions to be able to support our work. I think the power of our work in preservation and museums and cultural institutions in general is that it goes beyond emotion and we have evidence to provide. I think one of the reasons why I'm so in love with archaeology and in particular public archaeology is because when you dig up in that earth and you find that evidence, and you find those artifacts, this conversation's over. I want to hear nothing else about this. What do you have to say about these shackles? What do you have to say about this arrowhead? What do you have to say? We made it up? There's nothing more to say, right? And so I think we have to be able to provide this evidentiary reasoning, but also be able to build coalitions with different types of people. They all want similar things, but maybe part of different sectors and disciplines.
Can I touch on that? When Jimmy and Grace were activists, they were radicals, and Detroit was really at the forefront of challenging the system. The Detroit Rebellion, really shook the foundations of this whole country. Lyndon Johnson called in, hundreds of National Guard. People were killed. Mostly black people were killed by law enforcement. And the FBI monitored Jimmy and Grace, and of course many other activists, Black Power, Civil Rights. I was just hearing about Leonard Peltier still in prison, on the radio today. They were monitored by COINTELPRO. They have a thick file. In fact, as Grace talked about, she was so active in the black movement, the FBI file says she's probably of African and Chinese descent. The FBI would knock on their door, and Jimmy Boggs would say, "Please come in, because I have a lot of things I want you to tell J. Edgar Hoover about how this country needs to change." So Jimmy had the audacity, as he would say, to believe that he could run the country better than anyone else, right? And he would say, that's what you need to believe. Stop thinking like a minority, okay? We have to believe, not that we're just angry or protesting, but we have the vision and the ethics and the capacity to run this country in a more human way. And that's why, as Theresa said, we always have to transform ourselves and our communities and our movements, because this society and this system has damaged all of us. And so, that's why it is a big change to go from Grace having an FBI file to, candidates for president citing her as inspiration. But this is what's also important. Presidents are not going to do the work that we need to do to change this country and this world either. We're still going to have the problem of climate catastrophes. We're still going to have the problem of mass incarceration, white supremacy, wars, and genocide happening all over the world, no matter who is elected in November. And that's what Grace said. She was interviewed by Amy Goodman on the inauguration day, 2009, and she said, we need to get beyond the idea of a messiah, that someone else is going to save us. We are the leaders we are looking for. So that's what this house, and as we say, not just a house, but a whole district, a neighborhood that shows what it means to transform society from below, where people create a whole new, not just more money for education, but create a whole new pedagogy, where we are teaching children to solve problems, fix their own communities, and lead our society, particularly, again, low-income children from Black and Brown and Asian American communities, indigenous communities, right? That's what the school represents. That's what Jimmy Grace's model of leadership development represents. And that's what we really want this house to represent.
panel again for all your talks. I'll second the comment. It's really moving. My question is for Theresa. I really enjoyed seeing all the artifacts from your participatory design, and I'm curious if there was any specific example of an unexpected or interesting finding from those exercises and how they affected the design.
I think a lot of it is, one of the things I would say that I enjoy the most is how people have been wanting to be creative and there just hasn't been space for it. An important process point that I did learn is that you also can't go in cold into a community. I forget who said this in a previous session, right? There's a lot of understanding of sort of like my proximity as an outsider, racially, experientially. And so to get to a place where folks, especially when we're dealing with neighborhoods of trauma, which all of our communities are, all communities of color have, just when you're built on genocide and displacement, right, there's just going to be trauma there. How to create the space for folks to feel playful and be creative was something that I didn't realize was like a precursor to design. We never talk about that in design school. We're like, oh, just be creative. And we're like, actually, when you're just in the survival parts of your brain and you can't access like the physical higher parts of your brain that make you dream. So I think some of that was like how actually intuitive it is for people to create safety for each other. And the way that when you sort of are intentional about we're prioritizing care, how everyone steps up as space holders so that the creativity can really flourish, I feel like has been something that I continuously learn, more and more. And the thing that I feel very optimistic about is, the way that I feel like a lot of our work is being repositioned is beyond just like preservation, reconciliation, but also like, right, the deep healing that can happen in our community so that we can really, right, there's so much to dismantle, but there's so much possibility, right, that we can imagine. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the ability to dream despite the trauma that we have all experienced, I think for me is always, not only surprising, but it's like, wow, like that's the only way that we can move forward.
Thank you.
We have time for around 2 to 3 more questions before we break for lunch.
Thank you for your presentation. I talked more with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. I think one of the elephants in the room, right, is that while there are beautiful examples of cross-racial solidarity, in many of our communities, there's still anti-Black anti-Asian Blacks, and Black communities. So from Grace and James's life and life work, or from your own personal and professional journey, do you have nuggets of wisdom for how we bring communities together and heal?
Come on. I feel like we're dealing with that in a very real way. When you're thinking about scarcity, where there's not enough money, right? Like supporting unhoused folks now jeopardizes small businesses, or it's like I have my own needs that I can't take care of other people, and so I think some of the questions that we need to now trust each other, that our communities, and this is, I don't know the answer for, but these are the questions I'm asking myself now, is are our relationships and our communities strong enough to have these courageous conversations around conflict within? Because at this point, that is one of the largest threats, right? I think racialized capitalism is affecting us all, right? We're all starting now to compete for whatever we deem as successful for money. And so I think some of the questions is how do we create spaces of transformative justice. So for me, that is like, how do we address harm without creating more harm? And so there are ways that we need to hold loving accountability to some of, let's say, our elders, where there are perhaps implicit biases that we haven't had to address in, let's say, public ways. And so I've been thinking about, do we need to have like some of these like systems training of, the reasons why some people have fallen through their cracks, And so it's like, what is a shared platform of actual critical analysis that we need to have? Because right now everyone is so personally invested, but also just on high alert. We are in such deep threat on a global scale. So I'm trying to think about what are tools of conflict resolution and mediation, and deep loving accountability, and trying, how do we trust our relationships that have taken 145 years to develop. But I don't know, so I would love to hear the answers, like if people are doing it.
That sounded good what you said. I think for me, I riff off of Brian Stevenson, the founder of BJI, Legacy Museum, and Just Mercy, and all that stuff. He uses a term that I riff off a lot called proximity. And for me right now, I'm in proximity with you. I'm in relationship with you right now. That's why I was so eager to be here, to be in relationship with you, to learn and to hear, to listen, right? We need to create more spaces of proximity. I would love for you all to come to the Association of African American Museums. Selfless plug, it's going to be next year. Charleston, South Carolina, last week of July. So, we need to do more of that. Obviously, we also have the Latinos and Heritage Conservation, right? So we're here. We're here together, and we're sharing these stories, and we're understanding each other's plights, and we're gaining proximity. And if we gain proximity, I feel like over time, we'll be able to work those types of things out.
There's a model in mainstream politics where, at one time we were all just excluded. And as we got included, it was like, okay, you've got constituency groups, interest groups, if you can get enough votes out there and make your voice heard, well, first of all, we all have to work together to get, candidate we want elected. But then after that, it's like, who's going to get this many cabinet seats? Who's going to get this much funding? Who's going to get the seats, in the House committee chairs, right? That's a really dead-end game. First of all, because it's not recognized, and this whole political economic system has never served our interests at all, and it's not sustainable, right? But once we get pitted against each other, then it's a zero-sum game, right? And the reality is, the good thing about Asian American history is that we've always been on the margins, and we've always understood that system doesn't really serve anybody that well, right? Some people are getting more included now, but the reality is we've always had more of an outsider status to mainstream politics and culture. And so from the very beginning of Asian American Studies, Asian American movement, we've always understood that, unless we're in alignment with Black freedom struggles, Indigenous people struggles, Latinx people struggles, oppressed people struggles, worker struggles, we're never going to be part of a system that respects, our lives at all. So I think that's always been important, for activist-minded Asian Americans, that we have to have a vision that liberates everyone, or we're never going to be part, of a decent society. But it also means struggling within communities, right? When Omar talks about the Panthers having a vision of internationalism, they were also struggling against folks who were saying, hey, let's just assimilate into the existing system, or let's just be, separatists and have kind of a narrow view of nationalism, right? Those struggles are ongoing, and we do that by creating spaces where we come together based upon a bigger vision of who we are, rather than which minority is going to have, the best deal within the current system. And so Jimmy and Grace did that, and one of my heroes today, Adrienne Marie Brown, does a lot to advance that type of vision today. So yeah, and I've also written a lot about the history of Black-Asian relations, so feel free to look those up.
Okay, this will be the last question before we break for lunch.
Thank you guys. This is really heart-filling, and I have this question because of the work we're doing in Philadelphia and the research behind who is displacing us. And I think we're in a really different time because I think global capitalism is having a crisis. And so what I'm realizing is we're in this era of like private equity investment where a smaller and smaller group of highly resourced individuals are taking over large swaths of our communities across the world, across the globe. And I guess my question is, we're doing a lot of I call it the heart work, this sort of like reclaiming the collective sense of responsibility. But I'm also wondering if there's a way for us that are concerned about communities and concerned about preservation to do a little bit of the head work to sort of figure out how do we confront the economics of what's happening right now and the power. I don't know. I know, like, thinking internationally, there are countries around the globe that are facing the same thing and are developing policies and thinking through how they can push their government to be more protective of communities. And I'm wondering if there's a way that collectively we push some of the conversation in that direction as well.
I'll be quick, and you all should add something. So I did a lot of research on Detroit. I lived in Detroit 14, 15 years, worked close with Grace. Detroit really is the canary in the coal mine. For the super billionaires, the Elon Musk, and Detroit is Dan Gilbert. He owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. During the Great Recession, he bought up, last count, 130 buildings just in downtown Detroit. Right? And he got from the state government, hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to enhance it, right? And on top of that, people may know, Detroit lost its city government, right? When the Republicans controlled everything, they passed a law saying that the governor can appoint an emergency manager to run all aspects of the city. Every department basically was run by one bankruptcy attorney from Jones Day, right? And even now that it's out of that bankruptcy, there's no real authority in the city government because they're still under oversight. So any decision made has to be basically in alignment with these neoliberal financial structures that the emergency manager left in place. And if it's not, then they can come back and reinstitute that authority. So we've already lost democracy on such a scale. That's even before, all these election officials are being, now driven by, this idea of, hoaxes and January 6th thinking. So that's why it's so important that we have these alternative sites. So, downtown has been completely taken over by the gentrifiers and the developers. But there are still sites on the east side, right, where there are still a lot of vacant lots, where people can still afford in Detroit to buy a house. You can still buy a house in Grace and Jimmy's neighborhood for $25,000, and you can buy one. Even the gentrifiers are selling their houses for $200,000 to $300,000. So it's much, much more affordable. And we need to lock up that type of land in a whole different vision of a political and economic structure. Community land trusts, work cooperatives, urban farms, right? Those are the kind of things. And those are the kinds of things that transcend these ethnic and racial divisions because people have that skin in the game together, that sense of community, that sense of, as Trey said, the only way to survive is by caring for one another. You should talk about early childhood education.
Well, immediately I thought when I heard your question, I don't think we've been in a place of awareness as we are right now. I think social media has a lot to do with that and bringing in younger generations and really fully appreciating where we stand, our position relative to those ultra-rich. And I just think about Grace's words about, like, if you just get people mad enough, like if you just get them angry, the masses angry enough, then you can really compel change. And I feel like through people's awareness of where we are and how that has deleterious effects on our own communities, not just other communities. Yeah, I appreciate the question. That's what's really in my,
only way I don't get overwhelmed is when I see the glimmers of the ways that we're demonstrating the mutuality that we want to exist in. You know, so even if it is just a group of renters that are like, now we're just gonna pool each other our money so that you can pay rent the next month, and that being just another form of a relational safety net that we can create that gets us by, gives me hope, right? So in addition to, right, like the billionaires that have just like exponentially increased, hoarded their wealth, I just want to shut down, right? But then when I see sort of like so many, and we shouldn't have to do it, but so many of the GoFundMes, right, that, you know, or mutual aid asks that have come across that are getting fulfilled, right? And so people finding alternative means to get their needs met outside of these forms of capitalism make me realize, like, actually we can. And so I have decided to stay in an echo chamber because I cannot be in these harmful spaces. I have decided I am no longer asking for love from people that will never love me. So the folks that can be at those tables, thank you. This is why I'm no longer in those tables. But I think it's because we are imagining so intimately, so deeply the way that our worlds can be. I'm like, okay, we can.
I don't know if I have much to answer after that. I mean, just what I've been thinking about a lot is just how do we, I don't know if people have read, and God will be read on the book, Decolonizing Wealth, but just to really start thinking about what does that mean for our philanthropic efforts, particularly, you know, the organization I work for, but even the organization I represent on your board. How do we not perpetuate, you know, paying attention to what rich people want and paying attention to what the masses want. I've always been intrigued with the idea that we have to fall over ourselves for the 1%, but we do nothing for the 99. Like when we talk about philanthropic needs, we spend X amount of money wooing people that may or may not give us money, but we could spend a portion of that money and be much more impactful than 99%. And for me, that's just how I think about those things.
All right, thank you so much, Scott.